Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining me for Conversations with Alan. I'm Alan Locker, the child of two Holocaust survivors. I created this series to foster honest discussions about the rise of anti-Semitism and hate, with the hope of sparking conversations that encourage us all to reflect on our role in shaping history. My goal is to inspire collective action to eradicate hate in all its forms. These conversations are more crucial than ever as anti-Semitism continues to rise around the world. Tonight, I am honored to share the story of Abe Piasek, a remarkable Holocaust survivor whose resilience, courage, and joy for life left an indelible mark on all who knew him. Joining me to help tell Abe's story are Steve Goldberg, a dedicated history teacher who is taking a break from his 20-plus year career to share Abe's legacy and educate people about the Holocaust, and Abe's son, Joe Piasek, who will provide a personal perspective on his father's extraordinary life. Abe's story is one of survival, hope, and the power of lifting others up, even in the darkest of times. Together, we'll explore his journey, the lessons he left behind, and why his message is more important now than ever. Please, thank you for joining us tonight as we honor Abe's memory and his unwavering call to keep telling his story. Please help me welcome Steve Goldberg and Abe's son, Joe Piasek, to Conversations with Alan. Hi, gentlemen.
Hello.
Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Alan. It's great
to be here.
Well, Steve, you reached out to me back in November after coming across a previous Conversations with Alan episode. And I'm inspired by your passion for history and, your passion to go out and tell Abe's story. Where did your love, you were a history teacher, but a U.S. history teacher. Where did your love of history first begin?
That's a great question. I had a teacher in high school. I was not a fan of history at the time, and I didn't do particularly well in his class. It was an ancient and medieval history class, but he was just incredibly personable with students, and he became sort of a mentor to me. My first teaching job was at my old high school, and he was on a sabbatical. His name is Philip Burnham. People knew him as Dr. Burnham, if anybody's who knows him is watching. He had a sabbatical year, and he sent postcards from Paris to my students. And my students couldn't figure out how there was a Paris postmark on them or who was sending them. He signed them M. le Professeur d'Antan. I don't speak French, so I may be butchering that, but it roughly translates to the professor of yesteryear. And it was sort of like the way that I teach, that the word history means to learn by asking questions. And he modeled that through the questions that he asked. And I tried to get my students during my teaching career as active as possible to be asking questions and to get at the why and to, look at multiple sources. So I would say largely through him. And then I've worked with some amazing teachers along the way and had some pretty remarkable students too.
So interesting. And Joe, you're a teacher as well, correct?
Yes, communication at the State University here in New York.
Nice. I studied communications. Steve, I think I might have mentioned this when we first spoke, but I didn't like history. And I don't know if that has anything to do with my parents' story of being Holocaust survivors. I don't know why, because I am much more fascinated at this age today. But I wonder if I had a teacher who would have inspired the questions of the asking the why, because I think that is actually, I'm so glad you said that out loud, because I do think that is so important, and also learning our stories. I didn't ask enough questions of my parents growing up. So, Steve, how familiar were you about the Holocaust before Abe came into your life?
I've been thinking a lot about that. I mean, I'd visited the Holocaust Museum in DC several times, and I'd read Night by Elie Wiesel. And the year before I met Abe, actually, well, let me back up. There's a woman named Vivian Connell who she had ALS, and she was a teacher in Chapel Hill. I never met her, but a rabbi I know posted about her when she passed away and suggested that people watch this talk that she gave. And it's one of the best talks I've ever given. I've ever heard. I didn't give it. And in it, she makes the case that one of her dying wishes with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, is that she wants to bring her students to the Holocaust Museum because it's such a powerful place. And so I was inspired by this talk, and I asked my principal, can I show this to my students? Because she dropped some colorful language toward the end, and he said, yeah, try to cut before then, but it's okay. And so I showed it, I think in 2016, 2017, and 2018 at the beginning of the year to my students. And it was like about, standing up against injustice, and that the Holocaust Museum is this incredible place. And she had an amazing journey with her students there. And so I showed it to my students in 2018, and a girl said, so when are we going? And I said, when are we going where? And she said, well, the Holocaust Museum, you showed us this video that it's really important to go there. And, are we going to go? And I said, well, I don't have ALS, and I'm not sure I can put that together, but I hear what you're saying, and let's see if we can put that together. And that then led to, I guess the previous year I'd had a survivor come speak, but his family had funds, and his story was about how they were able to, get visas and get away. And many members of their family perished during the Holocaust, but they weren't in the camps. And he was a wonderful speaker, but I didn't have the connection I had with Abe. And then when I didn't bring Abe to our school, I don't know if you want to ask this question.
Yeah, I will. Before we go there, the story from this teacher with ALS, is that available online anywhere?
Yeah, if you search for under Vimeo,
you know what? Send it to me, and I will put it up on the link down below for people. They can watch it. So definitely send it to me. Joe, for me, I knew my parents were Holocaust survivors. They might have talked about it a little when I was younger, but it was after Schindler's List and getting my parents to do the video for the Shoah Foundation. For you and your sister, what did you know growing up about your dad's experience? Did you know the full scope of it, or?
Well, that's a good question. No, I don't even think I currently know the full scope of it. I'm, still learning and thinking and reflecting on the things that he had difficulty talking about when I was young, to try to kind of synthesize my memory to now add some meaning to what he said that fell perhaps a little flat, decades ago. So no, I'm not so sure about the full scope, although with Steve's investigative work and his passion on this, I've learned a lot more and thought about it in a way that I hadn't thought about him before.
Yeah.
And my mother is an American, was his escape hatch from needing to live that story every day.
That's such an interesting take on that, but I can imagine how true and how different than my parents, because both of my parents were, so they really couldn't escape that. That's really an interesting take, and I can imagine that must have been an escape for many survivors, finding a partner who didn't have that connection, American or not, wherever they were from. Steve, you are Jewish, but have no personal connection to the Holocaust, correct?
Not that I'm aware of. No. Yeah. My family came over like 1880s, 1890s.
Wow. And you, Abe came in 2018, and you said you had nothing to do with bringing him there. How did he end up at your school?
So our German teacher wanted to commemorate 80 years since Kristallnacht, which your viewers may know this, but Kristallnacht was November 9th, 10th in Germany and Austria, all the territory Germany controlled before World War II, where it translates roughly to the night of broken glass. And, hundreds, if not thousands of synagogues were destroyed and Jewish businesses and homes. And I believe about 30,000 Jews were rounded up and taken to, they weren't the concentration camps that would come later, but they were taken to Dachau and other places and basically given the message that, you should get out. If you have the means to get out, mm-hmm. You're not welcome here. And so she contacted the Holocaust Speakers Bureau in North Carolina, and they sent Abe, or we're going to send Abe. And I heard there was a Holocaust speaker coming, but schools are busy places. And it was the Thursday before he was coming. And so I emailed her. I said, what's the guy's name? I'd like to look him up. I'd like to do a little research. And, I was told Abe Piasek, and I was told a couple of links. And I started watching some video of him, and I said, my God, this guy's amazing. He was very joyful. And I think that I keep coming back to that. What drew me so much to his story is that he's like your grandfather telling you these stories, but he's also very, matter of fact and not like, oh, look at me or oh, poor me. It's just, yeah, my friend had his head blown off and I ran. And it's very simple, almost Hemingway-esque, like these declarative sentences that he just issues. And so I spent 5 hours that weekend watching video of him, and I put together like a prep packet for my school. And we didn't have an auditorium, so Abe actually spoke 4 times. He spoke for 45 minutes to our 9th grade, 45 minutes to our 10th grade, and then he went home to Raleigh where he was living, and came back the next week and did our 11th and our 12th grade. And my principal recognized I'd done all this work, and he said, would you like to introduce him? So I got to introduce Abe 4 times, and we sort of bonded over, when I told him the format, he said 45 minutes, and he was not happy with that. I could tell. And we sort of bonded over, this is not the way to do this. And so when he left after meeting with the 12th graders, I said, can I follow up with you? Can I get your email? And he kind of laughed. He's like, I don't really do email. And he gave me his phone. And I called him and I did some follow-up interviews at his house in Raleigh.
Now, you talked about Kristallnacht, November 8th, 9th, and 10th. And he came to speak on November 10th. Is that correct?
No, it was the 9th and 10th was Kristallnacht, and he came. I was doing the research about him on Saturday, November 10th.
On November 10th.
Which is actually his birthday. And so I had all these associates. As I started doing research, I came across he didn't have a birth certificate, but what he had in lieu of a birth certificate said his birthday was the 10th of November. And I was like, oh my God, he just turned 90 today. And I had all these associations with my father's father, who had a lovely 90th birthday party. And I was trying to envision this guy who I'd never met, what his 90th birthday party must have been like, and how amazing that mentally he was completely there. And just to be able to speak to a 90-year-old survivor who's willing to speak in candid terms was just an unbelievable opportunity. He actually came on, I believe, the 13th of November was when he came on a Tuesday, and then he came the following Monday.
Doing research for speakers who will come to your school, was that something you always did, or was this just something that sparked
I have training as a lawyer, so I like to be prepared. But this was way above and beyond what I normally would. I would spend like 20 minutes, like, who's coming? How can I link this story to my students' experience? And, once I learned as much as I did about him, I, made sure my students were particularly well prepared for him to come in. But again, the format of it was we only had like 45 minutes, and then afterwards, I think you need a chance to reflect after you hear a story like that. And it was because of our schedule. It's, you go to whatever your third period class is, right? So
right. Joe, talk about your dad, the dad you knew. How would you describe Abe?
Differently. I would describe him quite differently than Steve got to know him, because he came to my dad like that from the outside and above it with some background, with some information as a historian. And I came as, to know my dad as an embryo, and from the inside and then to the out. So I saw him from the underbelly, if you will. Um, he was a very well-rounded person. Although I didn't get to see the dark side of the moon until Steve actually and others shine the light on that part of him. Um, he was always against something big, and that was this idea of hate. That was always part of his consciousness. Although the way he described it within the family and in our daily lives as a kid was not joyous. It was, let me think of a word that might replace joy. It was cautionary. It was very cautionary. He, anytime there was any indication of hate, whatever it was, I hate spinach. No, you don't. You might not like it, but you don't hate it. And I said, no, so to get that definition of hate from his point of view was extremely informative. And I think very beneficial, something I carry with me all the time.
Yeah,
Not just about hating ideology or hating, even people's actions. There was this whole notion of what it is to reject something wholly, and wholly, that kind of rejection on the notion of where hate came from was almost like verboten. Was a word that should be purged from the dictionary.
Wow. Steve, you mentioned that you asked Abe to follow up. He, I think you said he was like, why? and you did. You went to his house, you sat down with him, and you told him about your students wanting to go to the Holocaust Museum. Will you talk about what you learned on that follow-up visit and his reaction to the students wanting to go?
Yeah, well, it's sort of funny. The first time I went, I was like, oh my gosh, I'm interviewing a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor at his house. What an honor. And I had like 4 pieces of paper that were, together like this. I had a really long timeline, like, okay, I want to fill in this. But I didn't record it because I thought, I wanted to just establish rapport with him first. I didn't know what it would be like. I remember now, I came to the door and I knocked or rang the bell and he just yelled, "It's open, come in." I was like, who is this guy? Like, he barely knows me. And we sat down, we talked for like 2 hours, and I told some friends that I had done this and I hadn't recorded it. And they said, you're an idiot. Right? Like, if you talk to a 90-year-old Holocaust survivor, you have an obligation to record it. And so when I came back, it was Super Bowl Sunday, around 11 o'clock in the morning. I showed up at his house. I think it was February 3rd. And I had my tape recorder and my iPhone was set up and I recorded and we talked for like 2 hours. And I mentioned as I was packing up my stuff that my students wanted to go to the Holocaust Museum. And Abe said, unprompted, he's like, oh, I've never been. Maybe I'll go with you. And I said, are you serious? And he said, yeah. And that's how I met his daughter, who lives in the area in the Triangle in North Carolina, where I'm from. Just like, is this okay? Can this really happen? And I was doing some research recently where, like if you're in a different place and you do a Google search, it sometimes gives you different results. I was visiting my father in Florida and I Googled Abe Piasek, as I do from time to time. And I found an article from 2017 where he was asked at the end of one of his talks, have you been to the Holocaust Museum? And he said, no, and I don't want to go. And I'm really curious what happened between that was less than a year before I met him. And so, in a year and change, something was appealing about me and my students, or something changed within him. I don't know what, but for him to say, yeah, let me go with you, was amazing.
Yeah, I mean, the gift of that to the students alone, and yourself. Joe, your dad came to speak to students at your school in 2017. And was that really the first time you heard him articulate his story?
Firsthand, yes.
Wow.
Yeah, that was the first time that I had a firsthand view of the way he told stories. And I think what Steve said a little while ago is that he came in and he had 3 or 4 45-minute sessions with your students. 45 minutes was the preface to his talk. That he needed another 2-3 hours, perhaps a day. And at SUNY Delhi, where he gave a talk in 2017, he elongated the introduction to the point where I thought, well, short attention span, the students are just going to, leave. But he was so
Check out.
compelling and captivating that they didn't budge. And he actually gave a long, long introduction for about an hour, took a break, 15, 20-minute break, and all the students remained. He came back and he talked for another hour or so. So he had a lot to say, a lot of stories, and he was a really good storyteller. And
When did he start speaking out? Was that around the first time, or had he been doing it for a while at that point? Do you know?
I think Steve also might have some insight on this too, but as I recall, when my mother passed away, was an opportunity for him to kind of get up and interface with the world without her filter. And that was in 2012, I think she died.
Wow.
Yeah, I sort of feel weird being the family historian when I'm not a member of the Piasek family. But the first time he spoke about it was the 2-hour Shoah interview in March of 1995. And shortly after that, in Florida, and I don't think there are any records of these, but he spoke at a synagogue or two, at probably a couple schools. And he was also involved with other community service, but he got a presidential award for freedom for his community work in Florida. So I know he spoke there. I would guesstimate maybe 20 times. And then they moved to North Carolina to be near Pam, Abe's daughter, Joe's sister, in 2009. And he spoke some while Shirley your mom was still alive. But then, like you said, he really picked up after that.
Yeah, the Shoah interview was the first, but it was private. It was in the home, and there wasn't an audience there. There was a camera there, and he was asked questions he really hadn't considered to articulate answers to in English ever before. And we always kidded him to his very unique way of speaking. I wouldn't call it an accent, because you couldn't put your finger on what kind of an accent that was. It was just the way he spoke. But his ability to articulate grew exponentially when he started to get out and talk. And his communication style, as observing what happened around him as he was surviving through these various circumstances, which very few people survived, was a combination of his personal firsthand experience and his firsthand imagination of other people's experience. And so over time, my sister and I would always say, was this something he did or something he saw done to somebody else? There was a big kind of gray area there. But the more he spoke, the more he kind of personalized and first personed the stories and made them much more impactful that way. But we notice, and Steve brought this up before, is that how can he tell a story of such tragedy with somewhat of detachment that allowed him to express it in ways that were not bringing tears to his eyes? And part of what I imagine was happening is that he was integrating other people's experience, and as he was describing it, he was actually seeing it for the first time, in a new light.
Wow.
And if I could, Joe, something you just said, when you said in English, right? Like I so wish I could have heard him tell the story either in Polish or Yiddish, right? Because there were things he wanted to say and he'd be struggling for the right word to say. And he, again, as you said, like when I met him he had just turned 90, he was a remarkably good storyteller, but it wasn't in his primary language.
We always thought he never had a primary language. And I've always thought that was really great because I think English is my second language. I have no first language.
Interesting.
And I think that if we can anybody can understand that the way they communicate goes far beyond and way below our verbal language. And I think he was able to create a language using English as its basis like nobody else could in these stories.
You mentioned the Shoah Foundation videos. Were you and your sister and mom not there when he recorded it, or maybe your mom was in the room?
I think my mother was. I was not.
My sister and I were in the room when my parents were, and it was, I probably heard a lot of things for the first time. Granted, I think my mother was 3 to 8 during the war. My dad was 13 to 18 during the war. Both of them found that interview very difficult. It was a stranger coming into their living room to do it. But it is so important. But I show the video sometimes when I speak out about it, and you could hear. I mean, my mother, breaks. It's something that they definitely put in a different part of their brain to do so. Joe, I mean, hearing him describe this at your school in greater detail than you had ever heard, what was that like for you personally?
It was really an honor to meet him.
Wow. Oh, wow. Wow. Oh.
I mean, I've known, I've circled around it, but that was an inside view that was an honor, and I really thanked him. I got to know my father through that experience and others, and much of which Steve brought out in him too. And he also appreciated the encouragement to tell the stories.
Wow.
As opposed to, don't talk about that, it will upset people.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. I mean, there's many people who still won't talk about it, Yeah. And it is so important. Sadly, my parents aren't alive to have seen that I created this series because of them. But somebody had asked me, what do you think they'd say? And I think they'd be quite happy, but very, very surprised because I didn't grow up in a Jewish community. So I wasn't verbal. People would ask what religion or nationality I was, and I never said it. I let them guess. And it was probably because most of my friends went to Catholic school. I was not surrounded by Jewish kids growing up. So, but in the world we live, it is so important that we are all here today talking about this and sharing Abe's story. Steve,
that was another thing I learned from my father regarding being Jewish, is that I learned from him as juxtaposed with other family members and other community members, that there was a lot of different ways of being Jewish. And there's a lot of broad understanding of what that meant. Yeah.
I mean, I was bar mitzvahed, but I didn't want to go to Hebrew school, and I think back that could have been part of my parents' story, or just not being in a Jewish community and feeling like an outcast. I don't have the answers, but you think about those things as you get older, and why I
So describe your father, or what is one word that, I would be asked, to kind of label my dad. And the first word that came to mind, and that still does, was immigrant.
Yeah, 100. I
And,
mean,
and as opposed to Jewish.
yeah, 100% correct. I would say the same thing. Um, I I just oh God, I lost my question. I something hit me at that moment.
Well, the story like this touches there's so many touchstones in a conversation like this.
100%, and 100%. Oh, I know what it was, because for me, it was Charlottesville. What happened in Charlottesville that made me want to speak up. It angered me to a degree that I just had never, and I didn't have this platform then. That was 2017, and it was thinking about what those images would have done to my mother. Not so much my father. My father was quieter, but my mother died of lung cancer. My mother smoked. My mother smoked because of, I truly believe, because of her experience in the Holocaust. Like, that was her crutch from a very young age. And so I'm curious, I know you didn't know the whole story. Like, I guess maybe the hate conversation that you had, how your dad taught you not to hate, and that should not be a part. Like, I think about the effects of their experiences. I know it affected my mother her entire life. Like, the fact that my mother always needed my sister and I to call her when we arrived anywhere, basically. She had no control growing up from that young age. So, like, she tried to control so much in her adult life. And I'm curious if there's things now that, time has passed, that you think of what, the Holocaust's effects had on Abe, your dad.
So, as you describe it, if you're traveling somewhere, let me know that you got there safely. That was definitely part of our lives for sure. And my life when I deal with my kids.
Mm.
But there's also something that he did that I need to continue on, that was the opposite of hate. I mean, there are many ways you could look at what opposites are, but reflective on that, and that's love. And so every Valentine's Day, Valentine's Day was like one of his favorite holidays. Um, he always gave my mother and my sister and me candy, about chocolate, hearts. So, for the last 30 years, 40 years, I've been sending chocolates to my kids, on Valentine's Day, and that's appropriating that notion of you're in my heart, versus the kind of commercial view of romanticism. That
Oh,
was one thing. And I think that he definitely used that, to express himself, very clearly, non-verbally.
that's incredible. That's incredible. Steve, you ended up in 2019 taking your students, going with Abe, going with Joe's sister Pam, and granddaughter and great granddaughter, I think.
2 great grandkids. Yeah.
Um, Talk about the experience of going there to the Holocaust Museum with Abe.
Yeah. When you just said Charlottesville, it got me thinking, right before I met Abe was when the Tree of Life shooting happened. And I was processing that. And I remember I live near Duke University. There's a free expression bridge thing. And some students had made a mural for, honoring the people who had been killed at Tree of Life.
Wow.
And in between Abe's two visits to my school, because he came twice, the mural was vandalized with a swastika. And the university, they cleaned it up and they made all the proper statements. This is not acceptable, sort of thing. But that was really that was the first visceral experience I had. I grew up in Newton, Massachusetts, a suburb outside of Boston. And, my last name is Goldberg. I'd never experienced anti-Semitism in a way that I was aware of. And so I think that plus Vivian Connell, the influence, all led to me really diving deeper into Abe's story. I just wanted to mention that. So, but
yeah,
to your question,
it's all of that. I know, even growing up, I was a teen in the 80s, and penny jokes were still a big deal back then, or being cheap, which I don't think I understood that as truly being anti-Semitism as I do today. But, Charlottesville, I went and watched the Vice did a 20-minute story. And those images were so disturbing. And I really thought my mother would have been under her bed. And granted, my mother was not naive to not think anti-Semitism still existed. She knew that. She proudly wore chachai. She was not. I have other family members who wouldn't let their children say they were Jewish because of their experience during the war. There's just so many levels of how it affected individuals. But yeah, so I get it. And what we're witnessing today is just, to the levels of it, is the fact that anyone is drawing a swastika anywhere is really just shocking to me.
Yeah, I guess I've told Abe's story or more than 130 times now, and it's sort of like, well, why am I doing this? It's a nice story, it's an inspiring story. I like to think that if people had heard Abe's story, they would be less likely to draw swastikas, right? And they would be perhaps even, this may be too aspirational, but be willing to say to someone who's doing something hateful or making a penny joke or to say, hey, no, that's not okay. And not just for to universalize it, but also to see the depth of what happened during the Holocaust, which was kind of amazing.
Well, you mentioned reading Elie Wiesel, who is a Nobel laureate's book, Night. Well, he has said, once you listen to a witness, you become a witness, and that doesn't just have to, talk about the Holocaust. You hear about what happened at Sandy Hook. You speak, you hear their story. You become a witness to these things, and sharing Abe's story, which I want to get to, what Abe had said to you. But the Holocaust Museum, what was that like, experiencing it with him and his family and your students?
Right. So I put together a GoFundMe, and the local media somehow found that, and they did a short piece about us. And that was the first time I met Pam. They came with cameras, and we were in their living room, and they asked Abe about the trip, and he said, "Well, I didn't want to go, but the students are going." And the story left off with us heading to the museum, and when we got there, I didn't know what to expect. And I later learned the museum is set up so that survivors can meet other survivors in the lobby. They don't have to go in to the exhibits. You take an elevator up to the 4th floor, you see the exhibits on 4, 3, 2, and you come out on the lobby. And so, Abe might not have gone in, and he learned there was a cattle car on the 3rd floor, and he said, "I want to go see that." And I turned to Pam, who I'd met once, and said, "Is this a good idea? Like, I don't want to traumatize your dad." And she said, "No, I think it'll be okay." And so we took a private elevator from 4 to 3 so he wouldn't have to walk the exhibits. And he goes on to the cattle car. And I thankfully had my iPhone with me. And, I videoed him walking.
I'm going to play that in a minute.
Yeah. And he started narrating.
That's incredible. Well, I before I play that, I just wanted to share a little about Abe's story. He was 12 years old in 1940 when the SS entered his town in Poland and killed or deported most of the Jewish residents. He was separated from his parents and sister, whom he never saw again. But shortly before liberation, he was put on this cattle car, which was roughly 2 weeks before liberation, and he had no idea where he was going. And you can imagine at 12 years old, the fear of being loaded onto a cattle car, not knowing where you were headed. Here is that audio that Steve captured of Abe describing.
I was standing with Mr. Goldberg is standing right there. The door was shut, and we were, you can imagine, about at least between 150 to 200 people, maybe a little bit more, standing or sitting, or you couldn't lay down. And there was the only tiny window was on the side over here. I was leaning on the wall, and a friend of mine was leaning next to me, and that's how it was. This went on when they took us from one camp to another. I didn't think I would ever set foot in a car. And my heart is pounding, and I had to show you how it was. Like we were in the elevator, we were packed in. That's how it was in the cattle car. Well, I was standing with Mr. Goldberg is standing right there.
What was it like for the students to hear that from him?
I've been in touch with a few students who were there, and they said, I'll never forget Abe. He created this unforgettable moment for them. And they had heard him speak at the school as well. So they knew him a little, but that was, it remains one of the bravest things I've ever seen. And I think he was doing it for his family and for my students and for posterity. We met another survivor after coming out of the cattle car. He took an elevator to the first floor, and she had been on 3 cattle cars. Abe had been on 4 during the course of the Holocaust. And my students asked her, "Did you go in the cattle car?" They didn't know. They figured Abe did. Maybe other people did that. She looked at my students like they lost their minds. And she said, "No, I was on 3 of those in real life. I would never do that. No, thank you." And she was amazed that Abe did that. And I don't have stats, but I can't imagine that's very common.
I'm with you, Steve. I can't imagine that is very common. I don't think it's very common that you get a lot of Holocaust survivors walking through that museum.
Well, I think the people who live in the DC area and volunteer there, they're docents, and they're often, like, our docent was a 2G. I think it was his mother or his father was a survivor. But I know that earlier in the museum's history, they'd had survivors taking groups around. But yeah, people who are just visiting. That was after that happened. I became an Abe groupie, right? Like, he told me where he was speaking next. I took the day off from school. I went. I videoed him. Who is this guy? How is he doing this? And I was going to be his agent. He had spoken to small groups, but I went to Duke, and my wife teaches at UNC, Chapel Hill, and I know people at NC State and NC Central. I was like, "You need to speak at this. This is an amazing story. You need to get it out." And he's like, "Okay." And he's like, "You set it up, I'll do it." And then sadly he fell in September of 2019.
And then he before he passed, he asked you to keep telling his story.
Yeah, I was in a hospital bed that was set up at Pam's house, and he was very weak at that point. And I came to his bedside, and he said to me, "Keep telling my story." And like no one had ever asked me to do that, and I didn't know what to say. I said I would, but I didn't know what that meant. And then he passed away 3 days later on January 15th, 2020, and then COVID hit 2 months later, and it was a chance to, what is really important and what is worth spending time doing. And that was when I made the shift to researching his story and starting to pick up the baton, as it were.
Wow. Joe, what does it mean to you that Steve is out there, sharing this with others, your dad's story, an important story?
It means a great deal. Steve is a historian. That we are historians, the ranks of historians are being thinned today. And it's really important. This story, of course, was incredible, of course, to me personally. But the idea of not just recounting or investigating or telling historical stories, but encapsulating them in time capsules, preserving them. I think it's probably one of the most, maybe even the most valuable human enterprise is to preserve the trajectory from which we came. And I think what Steve is doing is great.
It is so important. Like I said, so different from this vantage point of age, but like, God, if I could go, Steve, what you were able to do and go to Abe and sit down and record him, if I had really grasped what my parents had gone through and done the same thing, I'd be happier. I know a lot. I was able to honor the family that hid my mother away. Like, I talk about them all the time. They've been a part of my show because I realize us would not be having this conversation if that family did not take my mother and grandmother in for 2 years. You know, the impact of that. And here I am almost 80 years after the war. It will be 80 years. And that family is a part of my life today. It's something. So it's amazing. And you have gone out and you said it, you've spoken over 120 times to an audience of 6,000. You recently did a talk at the Durham Public Library on International Holocaust Remembrance Day. How do you think Abe would feel that you have kept your promise?
I think he'd be very pleased. I think, I think in some ways it's easier for me because I'm not related to him, right? He said something when I was putting this together for the first time. I was on a Zoom call with Joe and Pam and 4 of Abe's grandkids, 3 of whom at the time lived on 3 different Hawaiian islands, and 1 was in Los Angeles. And I believe it was Dan, right? Dan said, it wasn't like this is one of Abe's grandkids. He said, it's not like he sat me on his knee and told me a horrible story, right? Like that's not what you do at Thanksgiving. When you get together with family, there isn't space to do what I was able to do as an outsider, right? And Joe, if you want to pick up that you had this, oh my goodness, I didn't realize when Dan said that.
Yeah, that was revelatory, that point right there. And even though, my dad and Alan here, folks, they're not here, it doesn't mean we can't continue to ask these questions. Even though I wish I had asked, well, you can still ask. And there are lots of different ways to answer, but none of them are going to happen unless you ask, unless you're curious. For whatever reason. I was talking to one of my kids just yesterday, And I sent him some artifact that I said, this was Grandpa's. You might want to have this. And he said, tell me about this. And I said, I don't really know much about it. I'll tell you what I know. And he goes, I guess I should start asking questions. And that was really great because he didn't ask a lot of questions when he was younger. I asked questions when I was younger. I definitely had a curious streak, but I didn't get any real answers, mainly because of protecting the notions that what those answers could lead to, or the inability to articulate an answer that was satisfying, clear, or appropriate, for a young person. But that doesn't mean that those questions can't continue to be asked by us, by our kids, by Steve, by Steve's kids, by our students. Keep asking.
Yeah, it is amazing what we can learn if we do. And you're so right, like, because you think of what's happening in our country about how certain groups want to rewrite history, or the fact that there are people out there who try to deny the Holocaust ever happened, is unimaginable. But
I think there are two paths there, though, too. One is the deny that things ever happened, and the other is, okay, they happened, but who cares?
Yeah.
And both of those are, devilishly Orwellian, that we need to be aware of and redirect.
Yes.
There's also I thought you were going to say something slightly different, Joe. There's Holocaust denial, but there's also Holocaust distortion, which is not so much who cares. It's not as bad as they said, and that's not what the ovens were for, and it wasn't 6 million, and it's this minimizing. Yes, it happened, but it wasn't that extreme, and I think that's a disservice to the memory of the people. In learning more about the Holocaust, that I didn't realize this, but there's like 3 months, August, September, October, and this is probably when your dad's parents were murdered at Treblinka, that 1.5 million Jews were murdered in just 3 months. It wasn't like the Holocaust was a steady stream of murder. Scientific American if you Google Scientific American Holocaust efficiency, sadly, you'll find the article. And, that works. 1.5 million in 3 months works out to 15,000 a day. And that works out to 1 every 6 seconds. And when I say that to students, it stops them, right? To think about what that means 24/7 for 100 days. And that's only a quarter of it, right? There's another 4.5 roughly million who were killed, some before and some after. But at that peak moment, what was going on? And if you can start to understand that, then you can get into, the Rwandan genocide and Cambodian genocide and other, as humans, we do this, but the Holocaust is such a powerful case study. And for me, it was an invitation to really dive in deep, which I've done for the past 4 years, to try to, as you said, just keep asking questions, with Abe's story at the base, but also I've met other survivors and have done other reading.
Yeah, and the evidence is there.
Oh, the evidence. Evidence is there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Steve, has there been something that has surprised you most since you started speaking and sharing Abe's story?
I mean, I thought it was an amazing story. Like when I told his story a couple of weeks ago, like, students are just totally with you. Right? Like Joe, you were saying, you thought that his wind up, he would lose them. It's such a compelling story. I mean, I could easily talk for 2 hours, but I get kids who come up and say, thank you so much. And I've had a number of students who are of Indian descent, who talk about the partition that happened in 1947 and how they know that that's part of their family history, but their family won't talk about it, but now it's prompted them to want to ask questions, right? So I think it's a particular story, it's the Holocaust, but it has universal qualities to it that people just connect with. And, people are incredibly grateful after I tell his story. It feels, I don't want to say it feels good to tell his story. It feels good that more people know his story, right? And I feel like people are appreciative of his bravery that inspired me, and of, I show about 12 clips of Abe telling the story in his own words. And a few are like a time machine back to 1995 when he isn't a polished storyteller. And you get a sense of, wow, he really put a lot of time into, becoming the storyteller that he was, and, conveying this really complicated and personally difficult story, and telling it over and over. He probably told it 150 to 200 times.
Wow.
I'm catching up.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, you just said that, like, I only heard my parents really tell it in great detail. I've heard the show-up video many times now, but in person, that one time in detail, for me, it was like, it didn't all come together until Schindler's List came out. And then The Girl in the Red Coat was like seeing my mother, because she was that age, it was the one color moment in the film. And then my nephew was born in 94, my first nephew. And from a payphone in New Jersey, at the hospital, my mother called, the daughter of the family that rescued her. This daughter was her age, and they were, I knew of this woman my whole life, but to know that she picked up the phone, a payphone, and the impact, of the one person she wanted to call to say her grandson was born, it was like Chinese symbols coming into English for me. And I just understood the impact. And then, of course, I went 2 years later and literally went to the farm where my mother was hidden away. So it's, it is the impact of these stories. You sort of bear witness by sharing them.
I have one story that I heard as a child that my sister never heard. And when I say I heard this, you go, no, he never heard. So that's why my father's stories, they were hit and miss, but the one that really stayed with me for forever, will stay with me forever, is when he was on the cattle car and it got bombed, and he got thrown and woke up against a tree alive, seeing soldiers, American soldiers, approach the survivors of the bombing of the train car that they had bombed. It was a black unit, and they had big smiles on their faces with shiny white teeth. And he thought, oh, that's what an American looks like. Huh. And we moved into a black neighborhood, and I've always thought of myself as black because of that, as quintessentially American, which is why I really appreciate the 1619 Project and the idea of bringing history to the present, because the present is nothing without it.
That's the perfect way to end this. I mean, seriously, it really is. It shapes everything.
It does.
History. It really does. I mean, it shapes who, the three of us are today, It really. Steve, I think what you're doing is absolutely incredible. Before I let you go, what do your kids think of you doing this at this stage?
My son has heard me. I spoke once at the school where he was teaching and shared the story. And he's 17, and he's not a scholar of the Holocaust. He's more, I think, into he's more into saving the planet, and enjoys computers. And it's not, he recognizes it's my passion. I think I hope he's proud that that's what I'm doing, but he hasn't decided, I want to learn more about that. And but he's you have to ask him.
Yeah, I get it. I get it. Thank you so much, gentlemen. I really appreciate it. Steve, thank you so much for reaching out to me.
Sure. No, I appreciate it. And there's a website that needs some work, but it's myfriendabe.com.
Oh, great.
Are...
I will put that up as well. Definitely email me both of those and we'll have them up so people can find it.
And yeah, and get a picture of Abe. That's for people they've heard his voice on the cattle car, but seeing his picture is
his picture is up on screen.
There you go.
Oh, wow. Look at that head of hair. That's incredible. Oh, wait, I do have pictures. Sorry. And I meant to show them. I did put them up. Here's
picket fence, suburbia. Oh, there's that one.
There's that one. My apologies. I meant to do that earlier, but we were so engrossed. And then here's.
That's my friend Abe.
I love that. He looks so distinguished.
That picture that Joe just showed first, that's when I start my talks, I say how that's, Joe, if you want to hold that up again, we're getting a little glare, but that's the first picture that we have of Abe. It was taken in a displaced persons camp in Germany. And that's the picture that was used in lieu of his
So he's
passport.
roughly 17 because he was 17 after the war.
Yeah.
When they were liberated. Wow.
So clearly, Steve, the work that you're doing is evidence of my father's afterlife.
Well, you may have to cut this for time, but I think you know this, Joe. At his funeral, people. I didn't know your family at all, and I was there and was hanging around with some other people, and there was the cemetery in Raleigh is in a pretty urban area, and there was a deer that came toward a group of us who were looking and looked at us and then sort of scampered off. And there's a couple of grounds people were looking too, and they're like, that never happens. Like that never happens. And I like to think that Abe, talked with whoever you talk with when you die and said, can I go take over that deer for a minute just to say hello? And they're like, okay, you go ahead and do that. It was a remarkable moment.
I doubt if he asked permission.
Yeah, I know many people who would believe that was definitely a sign. And that's the kind of sign you'd like, at a sad moment like that. Gentlemen, thank you so much. Steve, continue to do this.
Thank you, Alan.
Thanks, Alan.
My pleasure. Thanks, gentlemen. Thanks, everybody, for watching. And as I said before, remember what Eli Wiesel has said. Once you listen to a witness, you become a witness. Thank you again to Steve and Joe for being here to honor Abe and to share his story. As I leave you, remember, we all have choices to make in life. Speak up, do the hard thing, and let's all fight hate for good. I truly believe conversations like this can change the world around us. Hate and war is not the answer. Please feel free to share these episodes with your friends and family. And until the next conversation, please stay safe.